welcome all of you to the European Union Center Brown Bag Research presentation with Dr. Andrea Muehlebach. My name is Mark-Jan Duchansky, and I'm the Associate Director of the EU Center here at the University of Illinois. On behalf of Brian Endres, the Center's Acting Director, and our EUC colleagues, I'd like to thank you all for coming to today's talk. The purpose of these EUC brown bags is for scholars to share research with our campus community. We organize these brown bags from time to time to highlight the latest research on Europe and the European Union in a variety of disciplines, all of which is part of our mission to promote knowledge and understanding of Europe in Illinois and across the US as both a Jean Monnet Center of Excellence and a Title VI National Resource Center. I'd like to take a moment to mention just a few upcoming events. On Thursday this week, February 22nd, the EU Center will host a talk by Tomasz Kamiński from the University of Łódź, who will speak about cities as actors in the EU policy towards China. That event is part of the Illinois Global Institute's lecture series on global challenges, which this year is focused on China and the world. On Monday, February 26th, we're really excited to host a silent film screening and jazz concert of Tigre Reale, a classic of Italian cinema from 1916, which will feature original music performed by Stefano Macagno and Furio Di Castri. And on Monday, March 18th, we will host EU Day of the Arts, which will feature a performance by the Italian dance troupe Artemis Danza, which is called Corpi Violati, and thematizes the issue of violence against women. This is also a collaboration with the Italian Institute of Chicago. And then finally, on April 22nd, we'll host another Brown Bag seminar, this one with David Cleaton from Illinois State, who will speak about reforming the Stability and Growth Pact, old wine in a new bottle. For more information about this and other events, please visit our website at europe.illinois.edu. I'm pleased to turn the floor over to Jessica Greenberg, who will introduce our speaker. Dr. Greenberg is a faculty affiliate of the EU Center and a professor of anthropology at the University of Illinois. Dr. Greenberg's research focuses on the anthropology of democracy and law, youth, social movements, revolution, Serbia and the Balkans, and human rights. She's now working, among other things, on a project about human rights in the Council of Europe, which is not an EU institution, as I always remind my students, but which of course plays an important role in promoting and defining human rights practices across the continent.
Thank you so much. Okay, I have my own introduction to stand next to you and read it. So hello everybody, thanks for coming. It is my great thrill and honor to welcome Professor Andrea Muehlebach here. Andrea is a professor in the Department of Anthropology and Cultural Research at the University of Bremen in Germany, and directs the program on Maritime Anthropology and Cultures of Water. And prior to being a professor at Bremen, she was at the University of Toronto for 12 years, 13 years. Her first book, which some of you know, The Moral Neoliberal Welfare and Citizenship in Italy by the University of Chicago Press in 2012, was groundbreaking in analyzing the intimate intersection of affect, political subjectivity, and the neoliberal restructuring of the European and in particular Italian welfare state. She is the author of many, many articles and essays. I encourage you to check them out, including most recently 2023 Life as Debt versus Debt to Life, Water, Finance, Infrastructure in Economy and Society. Also 2023 Contract as Frontier Device for the Political Publics of Water Infrastructures in the Journal of Cultural Economy, which is part of a broader special issue on what is a financial frontier, right? With alongside Andrea Ballestero and Gloria Perez Rivera. And for those who are interested in the theme of water, Andrea Ballestero will also be speaking on water politics in the Costa Rican context on Thursday. So it's our water week. She also authored The Body of Solidarity, Comparative Studies in Society and History, and has written on migration, politics, and race in Europe, including a 2018 essay, What is a Life? On poverty and race in humanitarian Italy, and is part of a special collection on whiteness and crisis in Europe with Bergon Books, and has a number of public-facing essays, including Toward a Social Infrastructure in Efflux, and How to Kill the Demos in Roar magazine. Andrea's new book, the subject of today's talk, is A Vital Frontier, Water Insurgencies in Europe, from Duke University Press in 2023, and it couldn't be more timely. She explores the politics of water financialization and remunicipalization in austerity-era Europe. Andrea demonstrates that the financialization of water has created new frontiers for capital, dispossession, and immiseration, and she reveals the deep links between authoritarianism, dispossession, and environmental degradation in contemporary Europe and beyond. But all perhaps is not lost. Andrea also argues that anti-privatization water politics has also offered a new language and models of solidarity that follow the flows and connections of our most essential resource. She tracks how community leaders, lawyers, activists, mayors, and others organize and resist forms of dispossession by claiming water as a public good or commons. Andrea has always been one of the most theoretically astute and politically relevant scholars I have ever had the pleasure to engage. But what makes her work so important is an attention to the intimate and ethical stakes of people's everyday engagements with care, community, solidarity, in the face of all-consuming environmental disaster, precarity, and other ravages of late capital. She speaks equally to her interlocutors, lawyers, community activists, Italian farmers, dyed-in-the-wool communists, and experts in the development of complex financial instruments. She is a voracious learner and endlessly curious. I remember meeting up with Andrea shortly after she'd done a tour of the Paris sewer system as part of the research for the book. She was buzzing with excitement about everything she had learned, all the minute details of the history of the system, the conversation she had with, I guess, was the state employer, the state employee, that had shown her around. Everywhere she went, she found someone to be inspired by, water to taste, experiences to value, and people to appreciate, despite or perhaps because of the incredible stakes they and we all face at the cusp of environmental collapse. There, I've said it again. I keep saying collapse, but I don't know what else to call it. As both a scholar and a human being, Andrea puts people and care squarely at the center of her work and her life. As anthropologists and Europeanists, we're lucky to have her in our field, and I am endlessly lucky to have her in my life. So, but no further ado.
I want to hug you, Jessica. I think you can all feel the love. I think it's very clear that Jessica and I go back many, many, many years, and I wasn't expecting this beautiful introduction, but thank you so much. Many of the thoughts that I think in the words that I've written have emerged out of the deep, deep intellectual friendship and the friendship that I have with Jessica. And I think in some ways this friendship is one of the most meaningful things that can happen at university, is when you find someone that you can engage and exchange ideas in your life with. And so some of this, as well as my first book, is of course co-created with minds like Jessica. So thank you so much. I wanted to maybe just start because I spent 13 years in Canada and saw the first wave of land acknowledgements and the politics around it. And so I just gave a talk yesterday at the University of Chicago, where I had thought about this. University of Chicago is apparently one of the only universities that doesn't, as a policy, have a land acknowledgement, which was very interesting for me to see, but some assistant professors have put the, land acknowledgements on their website. However, the one that I found most interesting was a land and labor acknowledgement, which was very interesting to me, and a new iteration of thinking Indigenous and Black dispossession simultaneously through, the University of Chicago. But what I just wanted to lead into my talk with is the question of this focus on land, which of course is central, but what it would mean to think about acknowledging one's place and making political claims from the vantage point of the water bodies one lives with, and what it would mean to think about ourselves as being entangled with the Mississippi River Basin in this case, and of course the awe-inspiring Mahomet aquifer that is beneath us. And I saw that the city of Champaign is part of the Mahomet Aquifer Coalition with other local governments, part of the Mahomet Aquifer Advocacy Alliance. So already there, the very substance of water, which flows through every single human and non-human, more than human body here in this place, is allowing for and creating certain kinds of relations. So what does it mean to acknowledge one's place in the world, not as a place, but as a relation to a particular kind of substance, a life substance, namely water? So I use the language of relation here also because I am very aware of the indigenous contribution to water protection and the lexicon of water protection that I think became most apparent, obviously, in the Standing Rock protests. Most apparent and globally available, I think, through the Standing Rock protests. And so I'm aware of this particular philosophy of relationship that exists, and I think that even though I'm giving a talk centered in Europe, and I also want to, of course, I forgot to say I am very happy to be invited by the European Union Center here, so gratitude to that too. I'm sorry I got carried away with Jessica's beautiful introduction, but speaking from the vantage point of Europe, also I think, and I'm hoping that some of the things that I will be saying in a moment will bear a kind of family resemblance and resonance to the question of what it means to be in relationship with water as well. I am going to start in the middle. So let me begin, and this is how I also begin my book. I will begin with this tattered photocopy of a bill shown to me by an elderly activist living in an impoverished village just outside of Naples in southern Italy. This person had rummaged through the archive of his living room, boxed up in a corner next to the piano, to find proof of the insanity of the prices that the partially privatized water corporation, called Gori, G-O-R-I, had made him and others pay. Here, someone was retroactively charged over 3,000 euros for a period of 2 years. This is what my interlocutors called a crazy bill. Then I have another scene here. This is a mother, tall, blonde, and I was told by water activists in Cork that she was the first person in all of Ireland who had decided one day that she would block with her own body and with the stroller and her son sitting in it, the installation of a water meter. This was in 2014. Things were very bad already in Cork. Not only had Suzanne repeatedly and increasingly failed to receive help for her autistic son in this very austerity-wrecked town, now the partially privatized water utility called Irish Water was going to install water meters that were not only going to reap more profits from the poor, but that she thought were toxic as well. She didn't know at that point that her protest, standing at the entrance of this working class estate, would spiral into one of the most massive social protests Ireland had seen in years, with thousands of people barricading the entrances to their estates, fighting police with their fists. And then finally, I have here the picture of a water fountain. This picture was drawn for me by a man called Claudio Pagani, and he reflects on the water utility I just mentioned, GORI, saying that, actually GORI, the actual acronym means the optimal management of hydrological resources, but my personal consideration is that it should really be called the optimal extraction of profits, GORI. But I think, in addition to that, that the soluzione ottimale, the optimal solution, would actually be a return to the classic old water fountain, which he here refers to lovingly as the fontanina in the diminutive, and it's really traditional because there's a pedal also, you can see all in caps, pedale. And it was a lovely moment because he winked at me and said, and by the way, my peachy Claudio Pagani, that was also the acronym of the Italian Communist Party. So I begin with these short scenes because I was doing this multi-sided research all over Europe, and of course one of the questions that we anthropologists ask is we encounter these moments that seem quite particular, but something holds them together. And one of the arguments I made in the book, the main argument I make in the book, is that I began to think about all of these political moments, these political and moral moments that I found in different parts of Europe as endpoints in larger processes unleashed by the financialization of public water utilities. So all of these three scenes speak to how people, whom I met in the last few years in Europe, comprehend and act upon what they consider to be the enclosure of a common good, water, that should be kept public and protected from the logics of global speculators. So water, in its liquid indivisibility, has appeared in this context as a kind of limit figure escaping from or residing at the edges of enclosure. For all the people I worked with over the course of the last few years and that I wrote about in this book, A Vital Frontier, water should never be rendered as a financial asset that distant creditors cash in on. On the contrary, it should be kept in public hands. So I explored in this book financialization in these processes not as a location, or a set of institutions, but as a distributed social formation that people encountered and understood as a series of often obscure and hidden practices with nefarious effects. What then does this broad distribution of this extractivist financial logic mean, and how is it discerned on the level of the ordinary? That was one of the questions I asked. Because finance is often represented as something that is abstract and unhinged from the real economy. Here in this book, I instead place emphasis on those bearing financialization's weight as its practices unfold on the level of the household. So the people that I encountered during my fieldwork, which I conducted mainly between 2015 and 2018, can't really be understood as subjects that are sort of subsumed under a steadily expanding totalitarian financial regime, but instead exist in this constantly fractious and riotous and rebellious relationship to this process. So I look at these water insurgencies here that took place and in part are also still either reconfiguring, recombining, or that have also petered out in Italy and Ireland. I also did research in Greece and Paris and Germany a little bit at times, but these are two sites that I visited quite frequently. And I ask what ties these three scenes together. So I hope to show that what we're witnessing is the unfolding and highly dynamic and volatile financial frontier that comes with its own sets of valuations, own sets of violence and modes of protest, and forms of sovereign lawmaking. As a German engineer put it to me, this turn to global investors to borrow cheaply on international capital markets has had cities exhibit a kind of pawn shop mentality as they pawn off some of their most valuable goods like water utilities for short-term monetary fix. Actually, there's very interesting talk about European cities and their relationship to China. I mean, it would be so interesting to think about some of the fiscal relations that are emerging there as well, because my guess is that it's a lot of investment coming in and a lot of debt financing coming in. But I would love to attend that talk if I could. So water utility privatizations have shifted away from earlier moments that involved small-scale private shareholders or smaller infrastructural companies towards a takeover by global private equity firms, sometimes also investments by big pension funds, public pension funds like my own, the Canadian Public Servants Pension Fund QP that I also will be receiving my pension with. I know that a significant amount of their assets are being invested elsewhere, including also in water utilities elsewhere in the global south. So public services are now becoming tradable assets, with households around the world engaging in the trickle up of wealth to the richest through the consumption of water. But what exactly is this financial frontier that I'm interested in? Obviously, a financial frontier is often conceptualized as a horizon of promise, but also a zone of extraction, predation, theft, and plunder. But what are these mechanisms of predation exactly? What form does this theft take? And this theft is a term that was very frequently used by the people I worked with as well. What are the violence entailed in this? And how must we understand this frontier, both ethographically and historically, in terms of its legal, political, contractual, and experiential effects? How are frontiers organized around specific techniques of valuations? In what ways are frontiers zones of contestation in and around legality and illegality? So my talk is organized into three parts where I try to answer some of these questions, and the three parts are price, police, and sovereignty, all of which explore financialization, the financialization of public goods in its distribution and its effects from these three vantage points. I was very interested in the fact that I think frontiers, and others have already made this point, are never necessarily never just made at the edge, so to speak, but also in our midst. For example, in individual households that I will be talking about in places like Naples and Cork. So we know that in addition to being squeezed by mortgages, rising rents, precarious labor markets, individual households have also become central to the frontier of capital accumulation that relies on the profitability of household expenditure, income, and wealth. So household payments in particular on things like utilities, energy, water, waste removal, phones and so on are increasingly bundled and traded on global markets. They've become anchors to the global financial system. As Melinda Cooper has put it, it's on the level of the household where, quote, terra nullius is today continuously being declared, as if for the first time, where wealth is extracted bit by bit in the form of mortgages, rent, fees, bills, and taxes. So on the one hand, one can think of this financial frontier, of course, as this monstrous, creeping thing. But at the same time, I was really interested in thinking about this financial system as having its moments of contingency and fragility as well, especially as its edges. Frontiers, we know, are always zones also of intense struggle and permanent provocation, as Tanya Lee has put it. So theoretically, I lean on a conversation that's grown, many of you will know, The New Imperialism by David Harvey. He himself refers back to Rosa Luxemburg. So since I live in Berlin, when Rosa Luxemburg was assassinated, I thought I'd go right back to the original. And who, of course, argued that exploitation, that is to say of labor, needs to be theorized in relation to expropriation, or capitalist theft and confiscation, which is, as Nancy Fraser then later put it, capitalism disavowed, confiscatory, underside. So we now understand through Harvey and Luxemburg, and a rereading of Luxemburg, of course, this is now an established understanding, that capitalism is constantly sort of reiterating its own violent origins, especially in periods of crisis. Our current period of financialized capitalism, a highly racialized form, as Michael Dawson has insisted, is a period of accumulation by dispossession, of expropriation, and that's on the rise. And it is dwarfing the exploitation of labor as a source of value and driver of capital expansion. Expropriation can not only be found in the Earth's peripheral regions, as Rosa Luxemburg argued, but within capitalism's historical course now, including Europe. We're reminded of Aimé Césaire's argument that whatever happens in the periphery will return. And in this case, it's sort of a double return of capitalism and colonialism to Europe itself. It was very interesting for me to see that a number of battles that I documented, that people there explicitly referenced battles that had already taken place in places like Bolivia, in South Africa, Jakarta, and elsewhere around water and water utilities. And so they were very aware of, in some ways, these recursive processes that were happening. Okay, so I see, sorry, I'm just, I don't think I'll go over time, but if I'm hesitating, I'm just thinking a little bit about time. So one of the things that was very important for me to think about is what it is that the term vitality also means to me, as I talk about a vital politics that's emerging in light of these predatory financial practices of debt financing in austerity-wrecked Europe. And I refer to these politics as vital, not only because everyone that I spoke to commonly equated water with life, or because some of the movements I trace are deeply indebted to philosophies of vitalism, but because everything, one can argue, is vital from the point of view of capitalization. You can render and squeeze value out of almost everything. Indeed, capitalist extractivism has anchored itself in some of the prime necessities of life. As E.P. Thompson, the historian, put it a long time ago when he was writing about the bread riots in the 17th and 18th century. In my case, it was not the prime necessity of wheat, but another prime necessity of life, namely water, from which vast wealth is being extracted. And the result are mobilizations that are quite different in content and shape from labor mobilizations, for example, of the 20th century, organized, again, not against labor exploitation, but against the looting and the theft of vital goods, not expressed through strikes, for example. And I want to stress that trade unions were important for some of these movements, but they were never the primary mover. All of these movements that I found really came from the household level, and it was often people who couldn't pay their bills who started these movements, and in some cases later drew in labor unions, but not necessarily. So they're not expressed through strikes, but often through very riotous gatherings, not focused on wages, but on the politics of just price, to use E.P. Thompson's language again, democracy and transparency. So water is life here. So let me begin here outside of Naples. This is one of the places where I did my research, called Castellammare di Stabia, a small town nestled just outside of the Bay of Naples. I drove around here with a local school teacher who was showing me his town, and he loved his town. That was very, very clear. And I remarked on the beautiful vegetation and all these trees with oranges and lemons and so on. And he said that this land, of course, is one of the most fertile in the world because it is enriched by the minerals accumulated through the mixing of volcanic ash with soil, the Vesuvio, right? This is a paradise, he said, inhabited by devils. But the fertility here is not just agricultural. This town also harbors, this town which calls itself also the Città delle Acque, the city of waters, is famous also for its thermal waters, which emerge out of the ground in the form of 28 springs. People said to me, you know, water is in our blood, water is part of our DNA, water is our medicine, and they were really eager to show me that some of the water coming out of the taps, depending on which spring one was taking the water from, was slightly fizzy, carbonated. The thermal bathing culture of this place goes back 4 millennia, and until this day, people come with their big canisters to take this water and drink it at home. I had come to Castellammare, this was in 2016, because it was still quite well known for water activists who had been engaging in what they called a campaign for civil obedience. The term had emerged in 2012 after a remarkable national referendum that had been initiated by one of the largest coalitions ever seen in the country. Thousands of water committees, activist lawyers, the Catholic Church, and to some degree unions, protested the privatization of all publicly controlled local services, including water supply systems. They also protested a legal provision within a law that had been passed without consultation in Parliament, that had guaranteed the adequate remuneration of invested capital, 7%, to global investors. This was quite an unprecedented referendum in Italy because 27 million Italians, so 95% of Italians who voted that day, rejected the privatization and above all financialization of water and insisted that it was a commons that ought to be governed democratically from below. This was the first time in Italian history. Let me just show another slide. Water should not be sold. Water needs to defend itself, or is defending itself. Here are some slides from this referendum. This was the first time in Italian history that an absolute majority of voters expressly rejected a series of legal statutes. Deeply indebted to the Catholic imaginative universe and buoyed by autonomist Marxist theorizing on the commons, the water movement used water's vitalism to juxtapose water as life with neoliberalism's culture of death, and water's sacrality with its desacralization through market exchange. Once it had become clear that the referendum would be ignored, however, the Italian water movement launched its campaign of civil obedience in an attempt to have citizens take the law into their own hands. First, by positing a categorical distinction between the lawfulness of the people, we made a referendum and we won it, versus the unlawfulness of the state, and second, by distinguishing between just and unjust price. Let me see. This is a poster of this campaign that it lies far back now, but I was really interested because it is a very interesting historical document of how people understood the law, understood democracy, and they said, if the state itself will not implement the will of the people, who is the sovereign, then we will implement it, and we will do so by canceling the profits off our water bills. The term obedience is very relevant and evocative here because, of course, the government is here positioned as disobedient and as transgressing the law, whereas the people are abiding by it, by implementing it bit by bit. By 2012, water activists were able to draw on an army of volunteers that the referendum had generated. Little booths were set up all over the country. Oh, sorry, I thought I had an image of that. Volunteer lawyers helped people calculate specifically how much they were actually paying in excess. It was this emergence of citizens as executors of the law and as price setters in this E.P. Thompsonian way that I was really interested in, and this is why I had come to Castellammare. But by the time I arrived here, it was also very clear that this momentum of the referendum, of hailing the state back into lawfulness and of setting just price, was very difficult to maintain. In towns like this, water remained privatized and water price not only remained the same, but in fact also increased. So the local water company at this point had begun to calculate water price anew and retroactively, charge people for water that they had consumed in the last 5 years and supposedly underpaid. Some of them had been sent water bills over 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 euros high, and I couldn't believe that they got bills like that until I saw them, because they were such important material artifacts of financialization and predation, and they were, photocopied and held up during demonstrations and sometimes burned in public. There was a demonstration, for example, where pensioners especially shouted and said, "I just received an 800 euro water bill, and that's almost double the amount of my monthly pension. I can't pay for it." So as I was sitting in this meeting room for many hours, I was listening to the murmur of conversation, and people were asking, what if we don't pay at all? And also, how are they calculating this price? How can we render this more transparent, what's happening to us? Some of these people have been heavily involved in the civil obedience campaign, and they attempted to counter the tactics of private investors with their own calculative ethic. And there were people who were still removing the 7% return of investment and set it aside in their own bank accounts. There was one man who said, well, if a municipality wants to come and take this surplus and invest it in our broken infrastructure, I will gladly give it to them, but I will not give it to the water thieves. It seemed to me that the citizens who had attempted to correct their crazy bills through their own calculative ethics, and in fact I remember specifically talking with you about this many years ago, and the idea of counter-financialization is something that we specifically talked about, that they were producing a diametrically opposed form of valuation, an opposed form of financing essentially, an anti-financialization, here it is, grounded in highly territorialized valuations of water as a commons shared by all rather than as a resource for a few. Put differently, one might speak of this as a popular ethic of just price, wherein ordinary Italians counted the volatilities of price generated by the privatization of their water utility with an attempt to reduce and stabilize the price of water. What I encountered in Castellammare, in short, was a revaluation project that sought to bring both water and its valuation back under stable local control. These were households that were, of course, situated at the very tail end of these processes and turbulent financial forms of valuation. Pensioners not knowing what to do with these bills. At the same time, the madness of this financialized water, and I call it madness because they called the bills crazy bills, was on some level also entirely predictable. Like the water utility would announce that, water will go up by 67% between 2011 and 2016, and then 31% between 2016 and 2019, and so on and so forth. But of course, this dread of opening the bill on a monthly basis and not knowing what it will hold introduced incredible new forms of volatility into households themselves. Many of you will know that in southern Italy in particular, youth unemployment is very, very high. So all of these pensioners, they had the one stable income that was still coming into the household. And some of this was in part distributed to their children and grandchildren who didn't have work. So the cascading effect of this water bill was also something that was very palpable in the room. So this is one scene. The second scene I want to talk about is the police. And I started my research in Cork, met some very, very interesting people from Cove, which is an island located just off the southern coast of Ireland. And it can only be reached via a bridge. And Cove became very famous during the water struggles in Ireland between 2014 and 2016 because it was so successful at pushing back and inhibiting the entry of trucks from Irish water into the island itself, into Cove itself. It became famous because it was the site of some of the most coordinated mass mobilizations that Ireland had seen in a long time. The semi-state water company Irish Water was going to install household water meters, as it had done elsewhere in the country already, meaning that Irish Water would come in with trucks, dig up the sidewalks, hook up individual households with water meters, and begin charging people for water. The installation of water meters and the prospect of austerity-starved household being saddled again with yet another bill, because they'd already seen the price of trash collection and electricity and everything else go up, rent and so on. So hundreds of mainly working class communities revolt. Standing guard at both ends of Bell Valley Bridge, residents texted each other about the approaching trucks and about which neighborhood they were most likely to go to. Most of the people mobilizing were women, the elderly and the unemployed. And groups of them sat, lay, or stood, often for hours, on sidewalks and streets as they blocked the installation of water meters. Elderly ladies brought their folding chairs. I think I have, yes, here they are. And sipped cups of tea as they sat outside. They sat there for hours, around the diggers, in the holes, and simply wouldn't budge. This insurgency gained momentum so quickly that Irish water workers routinely came flanked with police to fend off the crowds. And this is in some ways the iconic picture that was circulated everywhere. You have maybe 4 Irish water workers with their yellow reflective vests and about 10 policemen who are protecting these 4 workers from doing their work. There were countless scuffles, beatings, arrests, court cases, and in some cases imprisonment. But as one young woman said, people had each other's backs. Many of the working class estates, not just in Cove, but all of the country, were in complete lockdown. We simply wouldn't let Irish water in. Communities, and this is a quote from someone who was recounting this to me after the fact, we were so alienated from each other and so broken by poverty and the evictions that were happening and employment that we came together, and it was like magic. So Ireland is a really interesting case here because it's only one of only 2 European countries that until a short while ago did not meter its water at all. Water, in effect, was not priced, but was instead paid through general taxation. And it's very interesting living in Berlin now, because one of the first things that the Berlin water utility did, it had to be unified after having been divided for the time of the wall. One of the first things that the West did was install hundreds and thousands of water meters in the East, because of course the way in which water and heat were distributed under socialism was actually very similar to the way it was done in Ireland. So when this public-private company, Irish Water, decided to start metering, it wanted to install them in sidewalks. And it said, we will do this very efficiently because it would allow the company to read meters via a drive-by method. This means, Irish Water said, that we won't need to enter your property to take a reading, and we can read them more efficiently. But it was precisely these dreams of efficiency, enabled supposedly by the very publicity of the sidewalk infrastructure, that turned into Irish Water's nightmare. It turned out that Cove and other places saw such sustained mass mobilization and in ways that had remarkable effect. After about a year of protest, 2/3 of the members of parliament who were elected into office in 2016 stood on anti-water charges platforms. Over half of these politicians are still not paying their water, were at the time of my writing, and insist instead on general progressive taxation. The one party that really gained a lot, if anyone is interested in party politics at that moment, was Sinn Féin, because the way in which, and maybe I'll say this later, I can't remember, the way in which the revolt was articulated mainly was sort of an anti-colonialist discourse, which of course the Irish are very adept at and have a long history of doing. And Sinn Féin, of course, has stayed strong and in fact gained in votes. And I would, not being a specialist in Irish politics, but I would say that this was the beginning of a particular repoliticization of the idea of the Irish Republic against, the European extractive, financial regime, essentially. For the Irish, what was really interesting to me, and I was led through these neighborhoods, and people showed me these new meters that were plastic, and the old meters when water was still paid for on a district level. For them, these old meters were sort of a symbol of water as a sort of indivisible resource, and the metering, which was now being done individually for each individual household, was a way to divide into divisible parts an indivisible resource of water. This was, as people repeatedly said to me, the straw that broke the camel's back. You're not getting any more blood from these stones. However, what I want to focus on here mostly, actually, and what I was really surprised with, is the Irish police, which always accompanied Irish Water because of these many protests, and it formed rings around holes in the ground to physically ward off protesters. Protesters found themselves fighting the police with fists. As I said, some people landed in jails for obstructing meters. for me, the question that was raised was, what does this police violence in response to protesters tell us about the force and the authoritarianism of this financial frontier? If the meter itself is sort of a device of financialization, then what is the role of the police here in this process of capital expansion? While being cognizant of the particular histories of radical social protest in Ireland, of course, I want to foreground a little bit more broadly the much remarked upon relation between accumulation by dispossession and violence. And again, Rosa Luxemburg was somebody who said this very, very clearly before David Harvey, that capitalism is continuously sort of expanding into non-capitalist zones. Whether they exist today is another question, but they are rendered non-capitalist by capital. And capital often engages in extreme forms of force because it is precisely met with these kinds of barriers that Rosa Luxemburg already talked about. So I suggest that the Irish case here illustrates, in some ways, the fact that we're dealing with a kind of anti-enclosure insurgency that were intensifying at a moment of financial expansion. And we're seeing the riots and rebellions that bear striking resemblance again to the scenes that E.P. Thompson described so well in his moral economy argument. What was also interesting was the role of the barricade as a political mechanism. Joshua Clover, in his book Riot, Strike, Riot, argued that the riot itself with the barricade has today returned as a leading tactic in the repertoire of collective action. So labor struggles have in the main been diminished to ragged defensive actions. Not necessarily if one looks at some of the things happening in the US recently, but this was an argument. He was making a very polemical argument to counterpose the strike versus the riot and the barricade, which I think is heuristically a very interesting move to make. But the riot, in fact, has become an increasingly central figure of political antagonism. So one reason why I suggest that this was the case in Ireland is because these struggles have moved from the level of the household, where vital goods are at stake. This means also that women were often highly involved in these mobilizations, because mothers do the laundry, they wash the dishes, they bathe the children. They often also do the finances in Ireland. And it was on the level of the household that we see this return of the question of just price. What would it mean to justly price water? And we therefore also saw a certain mobilizations of a often very highly feminized public and the bodies of women in households to barricade themselves up against the police. What was also interesting, however, about the Irish case was that they were also able to rely on a certain social and material infrastructural durability that allowed for these mass insurgencies to occur in the first place. I was really struck by the architecture of these Irish working class estates, as they're called, and they were themselves built to control working class populations at the beginning of the 20th century, as well as, of course, the public nature of sidewalks. All of this created the conditions for the appearance of these riots. So Suzanne's protest, for example, really just started with her and a few friends, and they were able to easily block the single entrance of this working class estate called Ashbrook Heights in Cork. It has this loop-like architecture with one entrance, and then the houses are assembled around this loop, and in the middle there's the green, as it's called. These kinds of architectures were specifically designed as insurance against socialist revolution in the 20th century in England and Ireland. But in 2014 and 2015 and 16, they allowed for this highly mediatized blockage of Ashbrook and this rapid multiplication of this mode of social protest into other cities. So it was the infrastructure itself, which in the language of anthropologists had this sort of eventful capacity. It had this material capacity to create and enable and provide the parameters for a particular kind of appearance of the public body of protesters in ways that might not have been possible in other infrastructural contexts. So one might thus argue that there existed a kind of relationship between the public infrastructure of the estate and the sidewalks, and then the bodies that gathered there to assert their indivisibility, right? We want our water to be paid for through taxes, and we are here appearing as a public body and as a barricade and as a riot to make these political and ethical demands. So maybe some last pictures. Here's a good example of these highly effective blockades and some of the images that one still finds all over the internet. The last thing, I'm I think I'm still okay with the time. It's okay?
We have room for a little while.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have about 4 more pages, so I will just, this is the last argument I like to make about sovereignty. And we're going back to Campania now. So here I was driving towards Rocca Piemonte, which is a small village, which in the south of Italy is very famous amongst water activists because it was the only village that managed to keep its tiny municipal water utility public. All of the surrounding municipalities, 75 municipalities around it, had contracted their water out to Gori, right? You remember Gori from the image I gave you. But not Rocca Piemonte, and there was an elderly gentleman, Antonio, who gestured towards this landscape to me. We were standing on top of a hill, and it was really interesting because this was very clearly a sort of highly politicized and moralized cartography for him, a geography of good and evil essentially, because he said here, as you can see here on the right, where Rocca Piemonte is, water is free, and on the left, and there, water is free because it's public and it belongs to citizens, and this means that there's democracy and liberty, and on the other side of the highway, it's privatized. That means that there's a dictatorship. That means that the water there belongs to the water thieves. And as an anthropologist, we then asked the question of why, it was actually quite counterintuitive to me about why he would use the language of freedom and dictatorship when he was really talking about economic processes. And that's why I began to think about what the relationship is between financialized utilities and the democratic process, as well as questions of sovereignty. So I had gone to this village because Rocca Piemonte had over the years physically stopped Gori representatives from entering their village, sometimes by blocking access to the mayor's office, sometimes with kicks and punches into Gori representatives' stomachs, sending them to the hospital, and eventually Gori just sort of gave up, and the mayor said, there's a problem of public order, we just simply cannot sign the contract. I went to this public library in Rocca Piemonte. These are very, very impoverished communities here, and I found myself at a table, and there was a group of 8 elderly men, and being the anthropologist, I put my little, asked them whether I could record the conversation and asked them to tell me the story about their water committee. And they all started talking at the same time and wouldn't stop. And there was one man who kept on saying, we have a professor from Canada here, let's be more orderly. But it was out of this extremely lively Southern Italian conversation that this picture was then drawn for me. He was sitting next to me, and he was very kind to say, you don't need to understand what anyone else is here saying, this is all you need to know. So I wanted to mention this again because I really appreciate and find quite profound the image of this humble, old-fashioned water fountain, because of course, as you can imagine, in Italy, it's become a central symbol in the battle lines drawn over the present and future of water. The fountain's materiality and its symbolic presence, its level of disrepair and renovation, the quality of the water, the question of whether people drink from them or not, has in Italy become a potent everyday symbol for the struggles of the public water. I initially thought that this fontanina was a sort of a love object because it was a symbol of the 20th century's, hydrosocial contract of the state between its citizens. But in fact, there was much more to it than I had initially imagined, because groundwater use was free and unregulated in Italy until 1994. And of course, there's many areas in the US where that is absolutely still the case. And the Italians then initiated this national law in 1994 to register and license and meter water abstraction in these, especially rural communities where water was being abstracted. This also means, however, that small communities like Rocca Piemonte had for a very, very long time, always, since human settlement, just taken from the ground what they need. They had their own wells. And in fact, Rocca Piemonte still had its own 3 springs. And so it was able to assert this sort of independence from Gori precisely because it had its own tiny little municipal infrastructure, its water utility with 1 employee, and the springs. So the fontanina actually isn't really a symbol of state provisioning. It's much more a symbol of local sovereignty and self-provisioning and self-determination, I think. where a community takes directly from the ground what the ground offers. So the thought that an outside company like Gaudi would come and manage these infrastructures for profit was completely patently absurd to many of these people. As one water activist put it to me, you cannot sell to us what we already possess. The insistence on water as the property of citizens and of this commons as something that needs to be governed democratically from below by the sovereign, the people, has from the beginning been integral to the Italian water movement. We write water and we read democracy is one of the things that they often said on their banners. Si scrive acqua si legge democrazia. To signal sort of this indivisible link between local management of this resource and the democratic process. So in this last part of the talk, I'm going to explore another facet of financialization, which is my interlocutor's very intensified sense of having been dispossessed not just of water, but of their capacity to democratic action as such. So one thing that the Water Committee in Rocca Piemonte, like all other Italian water activists I met, said to me, was that they had made a referendum that was subsequently ignored. I've already talked about this a little bit. They remembered 2 citizens' bills that had been written through a massive national collaborative effort as a prelude to the referendum. So when a referendum takes place, in this case it was a long time ago, 2011, but the processes of what Italians call the political alphabetization of the population was many years, happened many years in the lead up to the referendum, of course. There were bills, laws that were drafted by a highly visible group of activist lawyers. It was a water bill on how the people wanted water to be managed in Italy. And it was discussed nationally through bottom-up participatory mobilizations. Hundreds of citizen assemblies were held across the country to discuss the citizens' bills. Activists had called the writing of these bills one of their key political achievements. Sometimes these assemblies ranged from several hundred attendees to much smaller gatherings, let me see, here, and were often deeply rooted, decentralized, local participatory meetings based on consensus as the main decision-making method. They were means by which the movement familiarized ordinary Italians not just with the process of making law, we're going to write our own law, where citizens became legislators and where people as lawmakers made new demands on the law, but with collectively articulating a kind of anti-capitalist critique. Eventually these bills were signed by more tens of thousands of citizens and presented to Parliament in 2007, and since then these bills have languished and will never be passed, I have no doubt. However, what I thought was interesting about this lawmaking from below was that it is really a symptom of a larger legal context in Italy that has been characterized by a slew of emergency decrees that have been issued from above by government technocrats with almost no parliamentary input. For more than a decade, the big state-owned companies, including the electricity, gas, railroads, telecommunications, highways, all synonymous with citizenship itself, as an Italian scholar would put it, had already been sold off to the market, liquidated or partially privatized, all via emergency decree. This was an era where Italy had seen the rise of an utterly de-democratized technocratic neoliberalism that intervenes legally into society in the name of economic necessity, urgency, and emergency. Around 51 emergency laws have been passed in Italy since 2008, some directly impacting the future of water. These laws and the velocity with which they have been passed show how this overstimulated and frantic climate of financialization can translate into a kind of overstimulated, frantic form of lawmaking as well. I think that 63% of all lawmaking in Italy since, when was it? I think in the last 2 decades, was made up entirely of laws by decree, and only later were they then passed by Parliament. But again, all in this sort of very rushed mentality of emergency, and a moment where it's almost as if the market itself becomes the law. So the Italians I met referred to this style of government as illegal, using the term as a diagnostic to comment on the state of disrepair, not just of their infrastructure, but of democracy. The general sense was that the dissolution of the boundary between legality and illegality, and that there was sort of a liquidation of democracy, as they called it. as one lawyer put it to me, we consider the law illegal when it is without legitimacy and when it is rammed through impotent legislatures without adequate disclosure, debate, or hearings, and when it's used to facilitate unconscionable bargains at the expense of the people. So this lawmaking from below, let me show you here, you can see also the active role of churches here, was an attempt to recapture and reassert the democratic process through the sovereign, the people, and it was really a symptom of the larger problem of what was widely perceived to be the illegality from it above. Indeed, one can say that market fundamentalism creates the conditions under which politics and crime, legitimate and illegitimate agency, endlessly redefine each other. And the line between them is a frontier in the struggle to assert sovereignty or to disrupt it. Again, who is the legitimate lawmaker here was the question that was being asked. Is it the sovereign, or is it the government, as the lawyer put it to me, who has really acting like a very badly, like an individual who's badly in debt and needs to sell their bicycle, except that you're selling off a highway or you're selling off telecommunications, right? No wonder then that some of my interlocutors spoke of this countryside as being divided up into free space versus a dictatorship under conditions of financialized public services. No wonder they were speaking about illegality and legality in the terms that they did. No wonder that they spoke of just price and wanted localized regimes of valuation. And no wonder that they were willing to go to the streets and place their bodies on the line in order to create barriers against continuous attempts at predation. So what studying the water movements in Europe has left me with is that we are finding ourselves, of course, at this frontier. These frontiers shift and move around, as I said, because terra nullius is continuously being declared wherever there's something to grab and take. But it's also a horizon in some ways. It is a horizon of violence and intensified inequality, but it's also a horizon that lets us ask what it would mean to think about water, not as a resource to be extracted and sold, but as an inalienable substance. What would it mean? What would a relation to the world look like if the world itself were inappropriable? And how could we translate this into an ethic and a form of life? Is a question that the water movement has left me with. So thank you very much for your attention. Yeah.